of the wonderful people right now that is really on the cutting edge of exploring how spirituality, science, economics, and the environment, all these factors are combined and making a difference is Dr. Ervin Laszlo. And so it really is a privilege to have him here. He's flown here just to be with you all tonight. So please give a round of applause for Ervin.
Thanks, Marianne. I hope you can hear me on here. I think so. Let me stand. I can't really talk very well sitting.
You want the mic stand? You want the mic stand?
No, I can hold
on. Your arm gets tired.
I hold this on one hand. I just got this heart. Also, you can eat what's inside. I'm planning on eating it what's inside. And in the meanwhile, I'm hold on to it because it's a nice conclusion. I want to conclude with what this message is. The heart message. But I understand that you wanted me to talk about the Akashic field, the whole concept of the Akasha. And I'm not surprised, because you are a group that calls itself NEXUS, and that means connection. And the Akasha is connection. That is what connects. You know, Einstein was not very outspoken in a colloquial way, but one of the more colloquial sayings that he said when we were talking about two things being connected without being anything there to connect it, he said, that's spooky. And it turns out that there is no such thing in the whole wide world of two things that are separated that will not be connected, because everything is connected. And if you ask yourself, how is that possible? Then you have to come to a concept that comes from the sciences. You can do it by talking, you know, by a strong voice also, but that wasn't my voice.
Next time I'll know. Everything's connected.
Okay. So how is that possible? We have known it, that it is true for the ultra-small domain. The quantum world is instantly connected. And it has also a number of other things about the ultra-small world, which earned it the label weird. It says that world is weird. I have another opinion. I say our world is weird. The quantum world makes sense. And if you want to get a definition of what we are, I will give you a new definition, which I think is the real one. We are macroscopic quantum systems. We are not only made of quantum, we behave as quantum. Only we don't realize it. Now, it so happens that traditional cultures, shamans, prophets, spiritual people, leading scientists or great artists knew these connections. They lived it, they sensed it. But the everyday world, in the Western world, the everyday scene, acts as if they didn't exist. We are only proximally connected. We're only connected by pushing and pulling. We are not connected intrinsically. The great scientists knew this, Einstein knew this, Whitehead knew this, Gandhi knew this, the Buddha knew this, obviously. All the great Jesus knew this. So it's time to recover this insight. And you can give it a name. I gave it a name. I'm not the only one. Because there is an example for it. 5,000 years ago, a group of seers in India, called the Rishis, came up with a concept of the cosmos, the world, in which all the known dimensions are embedded in a deeper dimension. And they call this deeper dimension the Akasha. So if you ask yourself, what is the world? In that sense, the Akasha is the real world, and space, time, and matter, and energy are manifestations of the deep dimension. Okay? It turns things around. What is real is not what you directly observe. What you observe is an effect of the real. Now, this same concept is coming through at the leading edge of the sciences. you're talking about a dimension, which is called, sometimes called the unified field, sometimes called the physical space-time. It can be called superspace. All of these things, certainly quantum vacuum, but you better forget quantum vacuum because vacuum is so misleading. Originally, it was 100 years ago. You take space without matter in it, it's empty, so we call it a vacuum. But space is not empty. Space is filled and space connects. We used to think that space separates, just the contrary. What we consider space is filled. The Buddhists knew this, the Buddha knew this. And I think all the ancient traditions knew this. Space is something which conveys. Now what does it convey? In this perspective of the modern new sciences, it conveys information in a very specific sense. I want to go to great details, but the great physicist who probably heard about David Bohm, decided to write information with a hyphen. It's information. It things that inform. One thing informs another across the limits of space and time. Now, I'll give you very briefly sketch here a couple of fantastic pieces of evidence, observational evidence, experimental evidence, for showing how thoroughly this world is connected. If you talk about nexus, the whole universe is a nexus. They're all members. Everybody is a member. It is known as entanglement, for lack of a better word. It's also known as non-locality. We used to think that if something happens here, it's limited to the here and to the now. It turns out that something happens here, it's so entangled that it also happens practically everywhere and at all times. Now, this first breakthrough in recognizing this came in 1982. It was to apply an experiment that Einstein came up with his colleagues Podolsky and Rosen in the 1930s. It was a thought experiment because it couldn't be tested at the time. It's known as the EPR experiment. It's meant to test whether it's really true what Heisenberg said, that you can only measure of a quantum, of a particle, only one or a few of these aspects, and when you measure those, the others become indistinct or disappear. Okay, he thought, well, let's take a particle, split it in two, you measure one property here, you measure another property of the split particle, well, they do the same particle, and you'll be able to measure both. Therefore, it's not true that you can't measure all of both of them. So they tried to do this, and what happened in 1982 when the physical experiment could be performed by Alain Aspect, the scientist in France, something completely different from what Einstein expected. Einstein was no longer around, of course, to be able to comment, but I think he wouldn't have been shocked. I think he would have welcomed it. But turned out that far from this being able to be independently measured one from the other, when you split a particle into the two particles behave as though they were one, even though they're at a distance. So whatever you do to one is immediately felt by the other. And it doesn't take time. And space is not a factor. This is known as spatial entanglement. And it seems that whenever you have a particle in a particular state and then it's split, then those split particles remain as they were one. And it doesn't matter that they have to be split. Even if you have two particles that at one time they were in the same state, they remain entangled, as far as we know, for all times. For example, there's an experiment, it's a cookie experiment, I'll tell very briefly. You know, if you take the light beam that reaches us from another galaxy, this can be observed here. Okay. If those light beam travels on a straight route directly from the other galaxy, then we know it comes here roughly at the speed of light, and we can compute that. Now, if it so happens that the same light beam comes from a slightly different angle, and it passes close to a galaxy, then the galaxy deflects it. Einstein would say it curves space-time. We could also consider, according to the ballistic theory, that the particle has some mass. Photons, we don't know if they have mass, but if they have some mass, they will be deflected by the magnetic effect, by the gravitational effect. So it takes longer. Now what happens, you take one particle, which you assume comes by the direct route, and you you observe it. There's an observing device. It clicks when the photon arrives. Okay. You take another particle, which was deflected, came another route where it was deflected, and you can compute that it come as much as 50,000 years longer. It was, you know, but it started 50,000 years before this. It gets here, and the two particles, which originate at the same source, interfere, as though they would have arrived at the same time, as though they would have been emitted at the same time, as long as they were both at the same state at any given time. Okay, mind-boggling. Now, this was an experiment proposed and actually carried out by John Wheeler, the physicist who died, but he was at Princeton. A couple of weeks ago, another experiment was reported. It was carried out by a group of physicists at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And they did the following. They coded a photon in a particular state. It's not a kind of state that occurs in nature, so it's a particular specific state. Okay, they figured that this particular state, if there's another particle in the same state, they'll interfere. In other words, they'll be entangled, because that's the idea. They entangled if they're in the same state. Only thing they did something funny. They destroyed the first photon. There was, as far as we know, there is no photon like this in the universe, because they very specifically, they created that photon. And then they coded another photon after the first one was destroyed. And as soon as they created the second one, it interfered. In other words, it was entangled with the first. That means that you do not have two particles to be in the same state, coexisting at the same time. What's the implication? The implication that the state of that first particle is still present. The particle itself is not. It's like homeopathy. Somehow you don't no longer have the molecule, but you have the information. The information is there. What do I want to take from this as a kind of conclusion? What we consider space-time, space and time, whatever there is in the cosmos, is no longer not that it isn't just empty. It's a fullness, it's a plenum, but also that it connects and it has memory. It's a remarkable kind. If you take these, then you get the concept that the rishis came up with 5,000 years ago with the Akasha. Everything was born out of the Akasha. Everything still exists in the Akasha. If this universe comes to an end, which it will sooner or later, it's not in our lifetime, then either by a big crunch or infinite space, then everything falls back into the Akasha, into this universal space-time. In the meanwhile, they are connected. Now, how are they connected? What possible mechanisms? Another cookie idea came up. This was a long time ago, 2 months. And this was the idea, an old idea that was not experimentally, you can't say it's proven, but it makes it very likely that it's true. And that's the idea that what we call space-time, which is the really real universe, is a hologram. Now, why is that? Just a very brief background. How did they come up with this idea? How can you sort of have an observation and an experiment? There was a particular problem with a theory that advanced by the great physicist Stephen Hawking. It's about black hole. Hawking is famous for his black hole theory. Now, when a black hole disappears, it radiates, very small, but it radiates, and then eventually it vanishes. When it vanishes, everything that was in the black hole disappears. So that the information that was contained in the black hole no longer exists. Now that's a problem, because according to physics, information cannot be destroyed. So where did this information go? So how can you tell that there's information there, and how can you follow what is happening to it? You can do it by this way. You assume that what's happening inside the black hole is a three-dimensional projection of a code, an information code that is on the surface of the black hole. The surface you can observe. Okay? The inside you can't, because it's the horizon. You can't get in. So assume this. Now, well, how could you test this? Because everything that happens inside is a three-dimensional projection, two-dimensional in the periphery. You assume that, I'm sorry about that word, but assume, I don't use it like you hypothesize, okay? You hypothesize that the grains of space-time, space is supposed to be not smooth, at extreme magnification. It has unevenness, it's grainy, it has particular bumps in it. Okay? This comes from string theory. And it's assumed that these bumps are Planck dimension. There was 10 on the minus 35 power, 10 followed by 35 zeros, divided one by that number, and so it's a pretty small number. It's so small that you can't observe it. Now this scientist, Van Hooft and Leonard Susskind and others, thought that one way to get over this is to assume that these bumps are coded in 2 dimensions at the surface. You observe the surface, and then you believe that what they code is inside. So if this surface is Planck dimensional, inside it will be larger because the volume is larger than the periphery, you know, and you have an exact relationship. You divide the volume by the periphery. So then, if it's Planck dimension on the surface, it will be 10 on the minus 35. Then the bumps will be 10 on the 16 inside. Okay, much larger. Okay. So in that case, in principle, you would observe what happens inside the black hole. So that's not the end of the story. That has been known now a couple of years. A couple of months ago, Craig Hogan, others at the Fermi Labs, thought, let's apply this to the universe, to space-time. I'm telling this because it's another fascinating idea. What is the dimension of space-time? It's the amount of space that has been covered by light since the Big Bang. It expands in all directions, that amount. Take the periphery of that, assume that it's papered by 2-dimensional codes, which are each of those codes is of a Planck dimension. The size of it is Planck, okay? And then you ask yourself, if these code what goes on inside space-time, what will be the size of that? And the size of that will be 10 on the minus 16. And then you try to see if you can observe anything happening in space at 10 on the minus 16. So they went to the German 600 GeoLab 600. It's a gravity wave detector. For the timing, at present time, that's the instrument that goes deepest down into the super small. Okay? And they see, what do they find? They were looking for gravity waves. They didn't find gravity waves. But they found bumps. What do you think? The bumps were exactly 10 on the minus 16. So if string theory is true, then the bumps inside space-time are projections of 2-dimensional codes on the periphery, on the boundary of space-time. You can make it one step further. Why only bumps? Maybe everything that in space-time occurs is a 3-dimensional projection of 2 dimensions in the periphery. Now, at that point, I part company with Craig Hogan, and I would look forward to, we may have a chance to do this. I just come from filming the new Bleep film, you know, they're redoing the Bleep film. Now the next Bleep film is going to be called Bleep What Now? Or to redo some of the things. So I had the role, among other things, explaining things, but I had to stand there first in front of the cameras and say, I am Ervin Laszlo. Bleep What Now? They had to fly me over to California. So Craig and others, Craig thinks that it's possible that we are all 3-dimensional projections of 2-dimensional codes on the periphery, on the boundary of space-time. Now, I don't like to be a mere projection person. And I think that is a bit exaggerated. There is another interpretation. I think what there really is happening in space-time is energy operating on the basis of very precise information that we call the laws of nature. So we have informed energy in the David Bohm sense of information. And this creates the universe. This universe is so very specific, very special, that chance is very unlikely to have created it. Another little element you get from string theory, ask yourself, how many universes would be physically possible? How many different universes? And the answer is another mind-boggling number, 10 on the 500th power. So you take 1 followed by 5 and 0. That many universes would be physically possible. You can play this thing out, I suppose, with some supercomputers, and it turns out that only a small handful would be capable of bringing forth life. All the others will be either collapse very soon after that, or will be only perfect uniform gases, or would not, the stars will not be able to shine long enough, to produce the energy flows on which carbon sequences can come about, life can come, etc. So what's the answer? How come that we live in one of these universes? There's an extreme theory called the entropic theory, which says it's because we observe it. That's one of the mistakes that I think that first bleed from the universe is such as it is because we observe it. I don't go that far. I think the universe is the way it is. We can interact with it, and we do interact and do change it, but it's not simply make it just by observation. So the concept then would be that not necessarily all the things that exist in the universe are projections, but the information on which the universe runs is a three-dimensional projection of two-dimensional codes. Why is that important? Because that means the universe runs or operates or functions as a hologram. Now, hologram has a particular property. Its information in it is distributed. In other words, anything that happens in a hologram is present, and the information that creates an image in a hologram is present at all its points. You can illuminate a holographic film, so at any one point, you get the whole image. It's fainter because it's smaller. The more you illuminate it, the more clearer it becomes. But you illuminate it here and it's here. You illuminate it over there and it's there. You can do it simultaneously, and you have two images appearing, the same image in two places. So, and you don't travel in time when you go from one to the other, because in a hologram, everything is given. It coexists at the same time. But suppose the information in the universe coexists at all times. In that case, we would have a real physical meaning of entanglement, of connection, of nexus, if you like, because the information is there. Now, this information doesn't take, if you travel in the hologram from one point to another, you don't travel in time, because it's simultaneous. The information, as far as you know, in a hologram can be conserved. It depends on the medium. Of film can degenerate, but space-time may not degenerate. It may be there. Maybe what has ever happened since the Big Bang, or maybe since a prior universe, which is also a theory, is still there as information. It's conserved. So space and time are intrinsically present at all points. Now that is a remarkable concept. To this, you just have to add one small little lemma. That maybe not only the quantum world exists like this, but all of space, everything that's in space. That's why I said, if you think of ourselves as being macroscopic quantum systems, then we ourselves are operating on the basis of information that is present throughout space and time. We can interact with it. And then you have a sense of interacting, or sometimes I call it dancing with the Akashic field. Because the Akasha is the deep dimension. So I think native cultures, indigenous cultures, traditional cultures knew this. The great insightful people knew this. We became weird by forgetting it. Just the other way around. And now we have to normalize, re-normalize ourselves and realize that the whole universe is a quantum hologram. And we are part of it. Now, what difference would it make? But before going on to what difference, I don't want to make it too long. I just want to sort of a couple of ideas first also. How would we receive information of this kind? Obviously, it's not information that's limited to the electromagnetic field, not only through photons. It's not only information limited to waves in the air, which is acoustic information, or touch, or smell. So it's an information that's instant, and that's present at all times, and somehow we receive it. here there are other discoveries have been made in recent years, which shows that the brain is not limited to decoding, to processing information that comes from the senses. It can also receive and decode information that comes on the quantum level. There are subneural networks in the brain. Microtubules are very well established, but apparently there are networks within networks within networks down to the nanometer level in the brain. And these resonate with quantum information. And so that space, as I said, is not empty. So information is there in the universe. And all you need to do is pick it up. It's like information from all the channels, TV channels in New York is present in this room. Information of all of the internet is present in this room. You have to have an instrument for decoding it. Maybe the brain can decode in potential everything, but in practice at least some of it. Now we have filtered out this kind of quantum level information effectively by claiming that it can't exist, we can't access it. You know, therefore, all that exists in our consciousness, in our brain, is what came to us through the eyes. If you allow that our brain is a much more sensitive quantum level receiver, not only this electromagnetic decoder, but quantum level receiver, then in potential you could access much wider information. And indeed, you have to ask yourself, do we perhaps access this information we don't know it? Then you have to take another element. The brain gets a hell of a lot more information than that we know consciously. Not everything that gets on it, in fact a very tiny fragment of the information that resonates in the brain actually reaches consciousness. A great deal of it reaches the subconscious. So there is on the right hemisphere, for example, most of it is not conscious. The left hemisphere has certain centers where consciousness is considered to be reside because you damage that consciousness appears. And the transfer through the corpus callosum from the right to the left is a highly selective filtered transfer. In other words, only some of the information that reaches your brain on the right hemisphere, including quantum level information, gets transferred into the left. Yeah. In normal states of consciousness for the Western modern world, it's a very highly selective process. Many of the things that happen, including intuitions, hunches, information that seems to come from previous lives, information that seems to make you communicate with people who are already deceased, etc. A lot of this information occurs, can be checked even. But it does not reach consciousness in the Western mindset for one very simple reason. You don't believe that it exists. If you don't believe that something exists, you don't perceive it. That's also an anthropologically well tested. So you can expand your consciousness. In other words, you can expand it so you can read a bit more of the Akashic field. The Akashic field is everything that there is, all the information. Now you expand this consciousness by entering what is known as an altered state. Now my good friend Stan Grof said, don't call it altered state, because altering is what you do to dogs and cats, you know, when you don't want to reproduce. It's a modified state of consciousness. In these states, some of the censorship of the normal state of consciousness is removed. That means that you can actually get more of the information. And what Stan Grof is finding, and other psychiatrists, a great many now, are finding that you get an incredible range of information. Stan actually says, and says it in his recent book, and said it before, that practically anything that exists in the world is possible to be experienced. And if you assume that everything that exists in the world is coded on the quantum level in space-time, and if your brain can access this kind of quantum resonance, this kind of information, then it's true. Of course, we can't possibly access all of it at the same time. That would be mind-boggling. In fact, a good definition to my mind, I don't want to get into theology, a good definition of God would be a receiver can receive all of the information at space-time at the same time. That's a universal mind. That's a cosmic consciousness. We only receive part of it. But we could receive a little bit more. We are not necessarily condemned to perceive the world through 5 slits in the tower, 5 senses. As they say, we could open the roof to the sky. As the traditional people have done, and as great artists and scientists are doing, we can have some credibility to it. We can begin to understand 2 things. One, information is very likely to be present at all points in space. All of the information that runs the universe, it's like a software, is present at all points. And second, the brain is a receiver. It is capable of decoding quantum level wave propagations. Okay? If you put these 2 things together, our brain is really have an incredible range, an incredible potential. Understand in principle everything. As Einstein said, if you could get this kind of information, this would be like reading the mind of God, which is the same way of saying a cosmic divine consciousness is the consciousness of the totality of this information. I want to conclude with just a thought. Why is this important? First of all, because it's nice to know as far as a philosopher, and I think for me it's important to know how the world is. I'm not sure I ever know or anybody ever knows it for sure, but I think the world is much, much more likely to be like a cosmic hologram than a set of billiard balls, which was the Newtonian concept. So we live in a cosmic internet, if you like, and we could be a part of it. So the second element is precisely, if you see and if you start believing that it is a potential for us to interact with everything in the world, then you begin to see the world, then you begin to perceive more. You begin to have more intuitions, more thoughts. I, in my own small way, practice it in that way, that I don't resist ideas that flow into my mind. I like to stay between in a meditative state, between sleep and awakening, and allow things to happen. And you know, I think 99% of the ideas that I work out afterwards come first in that way. Not everything that's good can work out, but when things come with a sense of that's interesting, you know, I try to work it out. My initial ideas came from music because I was a concert pianist, so while I was performing, these ideas came. And now, since I don't do that professionally, I don't do it well enough for the things to run well enough, I allow myself to go into these deeper states, and the ideas flow. Okay. This is a flow process. So this would be important because these ideas can convey one factor that I heard this afternoon talking in a session. And that concept is coherence. When you are reading more of this field, you become more coherent with it. Now, coherence I will simply define as a state in a system where every element is tuned, fine-tuned to every other element. So that's what you do to one affects the other. There is communication, multi-dimensional. You have a coherent system, all its elements are permanently in communication. Ask yourself, would that be a good thing? If you don't think of it in a mind-boggling dimensions, just think a little more coherence, a little more sensitivity to each other, a little more ability to empathize with each other, a little more possibilities for cooperation. If you feel that you sense that you are part of this holographic network of simultaneous information. Maybe you don't think of the others as being out there, nothing to do with it. Maybe this old idea of that is resurfacing now of oneness will sense become more of a meaning. And why is this so important? Because another thing that comes to you from analyzing the situation in systemic terms is that you see you don't maintain a complex system in a living state, which is a very unusual, unstable state. You don't maintain unless all its parts cooperate. All its parts are finely tuned to each other. If any one part is not finely tuned, it separates itself off, you have a disease. If that part just does its own thing, and we call it cancer. So you need to maintain a living state, you need a full coherence in the system, full cooperation. I've come to the conclusion that in order to overcome these tremendous challenges that are in front of us, we need to have a much higher level of cooperation. We need to begin to change simultaneously in the world. Start to adapt ourselves to the current situation in the world, and not to adapt the world to as perceived to a faulty concept of what it is. We think of the world as a machine that we can manipulate, we can fix it. We think of, for example, disease as something that is a breakdown someplace, and then you take a knife and you take something synthetic and you try to put it back again. Maybe you could render the system more coherent. Maybe you could, but now they talk about reprogramming your stem cells, which is a practice. I'm involved in this project. So that actually a cancer cell will partly die off if there are too many cells and partly become a normal cell. It's entirely possible. It's being done. It's the next step. Coherence in the economy, in politics, in culture, in all of the levels. For us to change fast enough to avoid really catastrophic outcomes in this world, we have to become much more coherent with one another. And that means we have to start thinking differently. As the famous Einstein saying says, you don't solve the problems in the same kind of thinking. The same kind of thinking that created the world is mechanistic, fragmentary, reductionist thinking. And you think in this holistic, holographic, interconnected, quantum entanglement thinking. If you start thinking like that, you start experiencing the world in different ways, and you have a much greater willingness, empathy to cooperate, to work together, to have a nexus which is real, not just imagined. Just the very last thought. How do you know that you have such a sense? I've come to the conclusion that you have to resuscitate as youth cultures are doing and old cultures don't know. A word which is now has a brand new meaning. That word is love. Love, not in a sense in which centered on a single person, or that it be included. A love for all the things that exist and evolve, co-evolve on this planet. In that sense, that embracing love, that all embracing love, is the sense of the new consciousness, is the hallmark of a new paradigm whereby you live a better, a more true concept of what the world is like. You become more like the world, and instead of trying to make the world more like what your idea is. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ervin. That was amazing. I know all of you are hungry, but I think we have a few moments for some questions, because I saw lots of questions on people's faces. But first, I'd like to ask one, be the first one to ask, because Ervin, some people may not know, was actually a world-famous pianist when he was younger. So he has something kind of in common with a lot of the young people out here who are achieving something early on in life. And so I'd like to ask, how has the creation or the coming into awareness of something like the Akashic field and this greater spiritual depth, how do you think it's complemented when you were young and achieving and really focused on that? And what has it revealed to you now that you wish you knew then? Because I think that's something that everybody in this room could benefit from.
Obviously, this question has been asked me before, and I've tried to think about it, but the answer is coherence. When you perform music, what I consider great music, everything is coherence. There's nothing wrong. You can't change a single word, a single note. It has wholeness, has completion, has perfection, if you like. And I thought, is that limited to some geniuses, some composer's creativity, or is there such a thing in the world also? And you start looking at it in terms of greatest influence on my life was Alfred Whitehead, and another von Bertalanffy, Emilio Prigogine. You're looking at systems as co-evolving systems. Each of them is coherent with the others. So the world, to use a nice term, the world is not only coherent, it's super coherent. Because coherent systems, coherent relate to each other. And I was looking for those things, and I don't know what what I find is reality, but to me it seems that the world is like a tremendously genius musical competition.
Any other questions? Anyone have any questions? Okay, then we'll go.
Actually, less of a question, just two thoughts. I couldn't help but think when you were talking about bumps, microscopic, the Planck level, and holograms. Part of me kept thinking, you almost want to say, but you weren't quite willing to go that far, or maybe not that you weren't willing to go that far or whatever, but it's almost like we're God's little personal DVD player, the whole universe. The other thing was when you were, and I kind of heard you talk about this before, but when you talk about how everything is consciousness and how we come together and we all, that is what allows existence. It just kind of made me think of Goethe. Made me wonder if he were here, he would be like, "See, I told you so." Wait, what? Anyway, sorry, I just had to joke.
Joshua, so right. You know, when I said transfer to consciousness or perception of the real world, of the deeper world, that is the key. How much we can become conscious of, then our consciousness evolves.
Fine, I was just cracking a joke.
No, it's a good joke.
I want to thank you for your presentation. I had a question about a word called noosphere as it relates to the Akasha that you're speaking of, and I wanted to know, does this specifically relate, is it similar in your interpretation?
Well, there are several concepts of noosphere. Vernadsky in Russia was one, even before Teilhard de Chardin. Teilhard de Chardin's concept is the most best known. It has a similar sense of an evolution. I didn't talk much about evolution because everything co-evolves. Evolves toward what Teilhard de Chardin called the omega point. I think the whole universe evolves probably through cycles toward such a higher and higher level. But that's going from physics to metaphysics. It's a good thing. Noosphere is the intellectual, the conscious aspect. And this is what emerges out of this. I think the universe becomes more and more conscious as it goes along. In that sense, it's creating a cosmic noosphere. The entire universe cooperates, collaborates in becoming aware of itself. In that sense, it is noosphere.
So you're saying we're evolving even beyond what Teilhard de Chardin imagined?
Yes, it comes from a deeper level. We didn't know about the quantum level, obviously. We didn't know about multiple universes, so I think we have a broader spectrum to deal with.
Thank you very much for honoring us with your presence, and also at the earlier panel discussion relating to coherence and purpose and vulnerability. My question had to do with the subject that Peter Buffett spoke about earlier this morning, which was, at one point he talked about that the more we consume culture, popular culture, it consumes us. And afterwards, he and I spoke of the notion of Terence McKenna talking about culture is not our friend, the idea of popular culture in some ways. I'm just wondering if we are looking at birthing a new culture, hospicing a dying culture, this birth of a new culture that could be focused on the realization of our interconnectedness, the realization of our of the possibility of living as coherent beings. What might you say would be the how to create those pattern interrupts in the field for more conscious evolution? So I guess a better way of saying that is, if the culture does have conditioning and programming that takes us away from who we truly are and what we're here for and what we're here to recognize about our essential nature and the nature of the universe, how might we be able to liberate ourselves from that type of matrix?
We all have these tiny little small questions. Yeah, if you try to pursue this, you'll never have dinner.
Short answer.
But That's why I talk about paradigm. I choose this very consciously. It's not enough to try to fix up one part. We have an entire caboodle, you know, the whole thing together is mistaken. It's based on the wrong premises. Based on this premise of a reductionist, materialist, fragmentary, you know, mechanistic idea. Man separates from nature, above it, manipulating itself, himself, herself, and nature. Because the entire world appears like a mechanism. As long as you think of the world like a mechanism, you won't be able to reform it in this way. You know, James Jeans, the great astronomer, said some 50 years ago, the world is not more like a mechanism, it's more like a cloud. I think it's more like the internet. It's a tremendously, instantly interconnected network of things. Become aware of this, you start acting differently. After all, we all act on the basis of some conception of the world that we have. Because we find good, and it's something I believe in the human spirit. We try to maximize to the extent that we can the good for us, but also the good for others. The good for us is coherence within us. Good for others is our coherence with them or their coherence with us. If we act like that, I think we could begin to be the change that we want to see in the world, as Gandhi said. It's a different mindset. It's a different set of values. There's one thing here to remember. I don't know how you find this favorable or not to your own particular lives, but there's a nice example that's coming through from biological evolution. When an ecosystem is coded, is governed by a species that is no longer viable, and it's creating problems in the whole ecosystem. According to Darwin's theory, you'd expect that the dominant species is going to transform its information. I mean, even after Darwin came genetic information, but the dominant species transformed itself. Well, the theory that comes up from since the late 1980s of Aldrich and Gould and others, punctuated equilibrium theory, it says that the dominant species doesn't transform. It maintains itself to the bitter end and then it dies out. So how is progress coming about? By creativity in the periphery. New cultures arising. They're constantly innovating. They are suppressed as long as the dominant species is dominant. Then the biologists call them hopeful monsters. They are monsters in the present sense, but they're hopeful they could be the next species in the future, in the next step. So I have given up trying to convert the mainstream, the dominant species. I worked for 7 years here at the UN. I was head of research for Unitard Institute for Training and Research. I just today visited the building, which is no longer owned by Unitard, but it's still there. I hoped in the late 1970s until the mid-1980s that you could create a new mindset in the political leadership worldwide, which would be sufficiently fast and powerful to transform. I have always been. Now I have two major hopes, candidates for rapid change. The business community, when led by insightful, even would say spiritual managers, and that's coming to the force. And the youth cultures, when they are onto this deeper dimension, when they're searching, and when they're coming up with ideas like oneness, like unity, and like love, then it's there. And I think these trends are unfolding today. And to me, this gives me the great hope.
Thank you. Now let's eat, and if you all have any more questions, you can ask informally through the evening. Thank you.